A racist and corrupt police officer threatened a black woman inside a courtroom, trying to crush her with fear in front of everyone's eyes. But what he didn't know was that she was the head of the FBI. And the moment she revealed who she truly was, his face drained of color, the entire courtroom froze, and what she did to him after that left everyone in total disbelief. It started like so many other cases, a black man wrongfully accused, a courtroom full of tension, and a police officer whose arrogance seemed untouchable. He walked into that courtroom like he owned it. He leaned on his badge like a shield, the kind of man who used the law as a weapon, not a duty. And when she walked in, confident, sharp, and unbothered, he narrowed his eyes. He saw her black skin, her posture, her certainty, and that was enough to trigger his hate. Because to him, a woman like her didn't belong in that courtroom unless she was on trial herself. So, in front of everyone, he did what he thought he could do without consequence. He opened his mouth, and spat his venom. "Oh, here we go again," he said, loud enough for the jury to hear, with that grin that hid nothing. "Another emotional black woman thinking she's the voice of justice. You should be grateful you're allowed to speak in a place like this. But don't worry, sweetheart, when your little show is over, we'll make sure people like you go back to where they belong. Behind bars or behind a counter, take your pick." The courtroom gasped, but the judge didn't flinch. Not one objection. Not one reprimand. Just silence, thick and heavy. The woman stood there, absorbing every word like a blade slicing skin. But she didn't cry. She didn't shake. She didn't shout. She looked straight at him, as if memorizing his face for what was to come. Because she knew something nobody else in that room did, this wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of his downfall. The humiliation was sharp, calculated, and public. And worse, it wasn't the first time. She had seen this man before, not in court, but in case files, in statistics, in broken families and buried names. He was the type who wore racism like a second skin. Who knew how to manipulate the system so well that people started to believe he was the system. He was protected by judges who owed him favors, by fellow officers who watched his back, by silence. And he thought she was just another black woman caught in his net, like so many others before her. But she wasn't. She was the storm coming for everything he built. That moment in the courtroom, that humiliation, was not just personal. It was history repeating itself. It was generations of black women being told to sit down, shut up, and smile. It was the smirk of a white man who thought his badge made him untouchable. And yet, there she stood. Not just holding the truth, but armed with it. What that cop didn't realize was that she hadn't come to testify. She had come to trap him. Everything had been planned. Every word he said, every threat he made, every chuckle in that courtroom was being documented, recorded, processed. Because what looked like a simple court case was actually the final phase of a 2-year federal investigation, with him at the center of it. But it wasn't just about him. It was about what he represented, the dirty underbelly of a police department drowning in cover-ups, abuse, and unchecked power. And while he thought he was humiliating her, she was setting the final piece in place. Because once she revealed who she truly was, not just a witness, not just a woman, but the person leading the operation, everything would fall apart. His legacy, his career, his freedom. Gone. Still, the most shocking part wasn't the reveal. It wasn't even the takedown. It was what she chose to do with the power she had. Because revenge? That would have been easy. But what she did was far more brilliant, far more devastating, and it left the entire courtroom, no, the entire city, speechless. How do you dismantle a man who believes he controls the system? How do you break someone who spent a lifetime breaking others? And what happens when the woman he tried to destroy turns out to be the very force that brings his empire to its knees? You're not going to believe how she did it. And trust me, you won't see it coming. Stay with us. This story. It's just getting started. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism, hate, or injustice. If you're a black viewer watching this, know this: your voice matters, your life matters, and your story deserves to be told with strength and dignity. This channel is a safe space that uplifts truth, justice, and powerful storytelling that reflects real struggles and real triumphs. Now sit back and get ready, because this story will hit deep. And hey, if you believe in stories that twist reality and give power back to the people, don't forget to subscribe and join this community. Let's begin. Her name was Aaliyah Carter. Born and raised on the south side of Richmond, Virginia, in a neighborhood where police sirens were as common as birdsong and where the word justice often felt like a fairy tale told to quiet the restless, Aaliyah learned early that the world saw her differently. Her mother, Denise, worked double shifts as a nurse, and her father, Jerome, was a former Marine turned bus driver after a workplace injury cost him his military career. They raised her with unshakable pride, not in wealth or status, but in resilience, in truth, and in the responsibility to stand up even when your legs shake. From a young age, Aaliyah carried herself like someone who knew she had something to prove, not to the world, but to herself. And maybe, in a way, to all the women who had been silenced before her. She wasn't loud, but when she spoke, people listened. She didn't posture, but her presence filled every room she walked into. Aaliyah was a woman of precision, of discipline, of vision. She graduated top of her class at Howard University, then Quantico, and by the time she was 32, she had already led multiple covert operations for the FBI. But she never flaunted it. To her, the badge wasn't an accessory, it was a mission. And even with all her accomplishments, there were times she still walked into rooms and felt eyes doubt her. Not because of her skill, but because of her skin. Because of her hair. Because of her gender. Still, she never flinched. Because she'd made a silent vow to that little girl growing up in Richmond: you will walk into every space like you belong there, even if you have to build the door yourself. The city where this story unfolds is Charlotte, North Carolina. A place growing fast, with neighborhoods being rebuilt overnight and others forgotten just as quickly. It's a city with banks and startups downtown, and over-policed communities just 10 minutes away. A place where opportunity and inequality sleep on the same street. And it was there that Aaliyah was assigned to a highly sensitive case, one that involved corruption within local law enforcement. The kind of case most agents tiptoe around. But Aaliyah didn't do tiptoeing. She chose to go in deep, no badge, no title, no protection. She wasn't just after evidence, she was after truth. And she knew that truth didn't come easy. Especially not in places where silence had been currency for decades. Opposite her stood Officer Bradley Kessler. White, mid-40s, broad-shouldered with a jaw carved like he was cast to play a war hero. But behind his blue eyes was something darker. Kessler was a product of a different world. He grew up in nearby Gastonia, raised by a father who was once a police chief and a mother who never let anyone forget it. From his early days at the academy, Kessler was known for getting things done, by any means necessary. He made arrests, cracked down on gangs, and cleared cases with impressive speed. But if you looked closer, the numbers didn't tell the whole story. His cases were disproportionately targeting black men, his testimonies often contradicted by body cams, and his name showed up one too many times in civil complaints that never made it to court. Still, in the eyes of his precinct, he was a hero. Decorated. Celebrated. Protected. And over time, Kessler began to believe in his own myth. He believed he was the law. And that gave him a certain swagger, a cruelty dressed in professionalism, the kind that made witnesses withdraw, lawyers second-guess, and supervisors look the other way. He was good at wearing the mask, until someone like Aaliyah stepped into his world. The courtroom where it all happened was inside the Mecklenburg County Courthouse, a sterile, towering building with echoes that swallowed your voice and marble floors that felt colder than truth itself. Aaliyah had walked those halls a dozen times under different names, different missions, always observing, always learning. But this time was different. She was stepping into the lion's den not as an agent, but as a witness, strategically. Everything had been calculated. The timing. The seating. The moment she would speak. Because this trial wasn't about just another corrupted officer. It was about exposing a system that had allowed men like Kessler to thrive. Aaliyah was called to testify in a case involving the wrongful arrest and excessive force used on her younger brother, Malik. He had been stopped during a traffic check and brutalized without cause. The videos had surfaced online, but they were quickly dismissed as out of context. And when Aaliyah tried to file a formal complaint, the department claimed Malik had resisted arrest and that the officer involved, Kessler, had acted appropriately. But she knew better. She'd seen the pattern. She had traced his name through case after case and found a web of misconduct too tangled to ignore. That's when she made the decision, go undercover, not just as an agent, but as a civilian. Become the thread that would unravel everything. When she took the stand, dressed not in a suit of power but in the skin of vulnerability, something shifted. The courtroom, packed with police sympathizers and those who feared them, became a stage for something far more dangerous than a trial. It became a battleground of perception. And Kessler? He played his role to perfection. He leaned back in his chair, smirking, confident, invincible. When she began to speak, detailing the night her brother was arrested, his injuries, the inconsistencies in the report, Kessler couldn't contain himself. You sure know how to cry on cue, he laughed, eyes scanning the jury, seeking alliance. These people will believe anything if you say it with enough tears. Next thing you know, she'll be telling us she works for the FBI. Laughter scattered among his peers. Even the judge cracked a smile. But Aaliyah didn't flinch. Her hands stayed still. Her eyes locked with his. Because this was exactly what she needed them to do, show who they really were when they thought no one important was watching. But she was watching. And more importantly, she was recording. Every gesture. Every word. Every smirk. It was all being used as evidence for something far bigger than that courtroom. Still, the moment stung. Because for a woman who had led raids, cracked codes, brought down entire trafficking rings, it shouldn't have come to this. She shouldn't have to strip herself of her title just to be believed. She shouldn't have to stand there and swallow humiliation just to make them expose themselves. But she did it anyway. Not because she had to, but because he had to be stopped. And because she wasn't just doing this for her brother. She was doing it for every person who had been silenced, shoved, framed, or forgotten. As the trial moved forward, so did the whispers. Court clerks began noticing inconsistencies. The defense attorney, a young woman named Marissa, started receiving anonymous files, documents, surveillance photos, statements from internal affairs. All leading back to Kessler. And while Aaliyah remained composed, the pressure beneath the surface began to build. Because once you begin to pull at a thread that's woven into everything, the entire fabric starts to tear. Kessler sensed it. His tone became more aggressive. His words sharper. He started arriving late, accusing others of sabotaging him. The man who once walked with the confidence of a king now looked over his shoulder. Because what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his biggest mistake wasn't what he did to Malik. His biggest mistake was underestimating the woman who had just stepped into his kingdom and lit the match. And as the final day of testimony approached, Aaliyah prepared for what was coming next. The reveal. The takedown. But not yet. She needed him to believe he'd won, just for a little longer. She needed them all to laugh one last time. Because once the truth hit that room, there would be no more laughter. Only silence. And maybe, if they were smart, a little fear. The courtroom seemed colder that morning. Not because of the air conditioning or the shadows creeping in through the high windows, but because of the energy. Something was shifting. Even the court clerks felt it, scribbling notes more nervously, side-eyeing every move the attorneys made. Aaliyah entered that space with the same stillness as always, dressed simply, almost deliberately unremarkable, but carrying a presence that stole the oxygen from the room. It wasn't just her testimony that was under scrutiny anymore, it was the way she had started to draw eyes, attention, whispers. The more she spoke, the more people started to look beyond the surface of the case. The defense was rattled, the prosecutors cautious. Only Officer Kessler remained publicly unshaken. But behind his blue eyes, something darker was brewing, suspicion, anxiety, and the slow realization that maybe, just maybe, this woman was not who she claimed to be. He approached her in the hallway during recess, cornering her by the water fountain, when the hallway was empty, and the cameras weren't watching. His voice low, menacing, just above a whisper. "You think you're clever? I've been doing this longer than you've been walking," he hissed, stepping close enough to make her jaw tense. "You come in here pretending you know what justice is. Let me give you a lesson, justice don't come with tears and little speeches. It comes with power. And I've got it. You're just a name on paper. And soon, not even that." Aaliyah stared back, unmoved. "Is that a threat, officer?" she replied, her voice soft but sharp enough to slice through his arrogance. "Because it sounds a lot like intimidation, and I've heard enough of that to know what it looks like. You might want to be careful with your words." He laughed, that same bitter, smug laugh that echoed with entitlement. "You don't scare me," he muttered, walking off. "You're just another mouth. I've shut down louder ones." That exchange stayed with her as she returned to the courtroom. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was so expected. He was playing directly into her hands, and the tighter he squeezed, the more his grip would slip. She didn't need to fight back. She just needed to let him keep digging. Over the next few days, testimonies came in rapid succession. Officers from Kessler's unit, reluctant at first, began to stumble under cross-examinations. One of them, a younger cop named Eric Morales, shifted in his seat as he was questioned about a night patrol 3 months prior. Aaliyah watched from the back of the courtroom as his hands trembled slightly. I remember the night," Eric said, avoiding eye contact. "We were running a checkpoint on 9th, Kessler, he told us to flag any car that looked like it didn't belong. When I asked what that meant, he just said, 'You'll know. Dark windows, dark skin, loud music. You'll know.'" The courtroom froze. No one breathed. "And did you question that instruction?" the attorney pressed. "No," Morales said, swallowing. "Because if you do, you're off the schedule. Or worse. You get pulled aside. Nobody questions Kessler." Later that evening, Morales found Aaliyah in the parking garage. He approached her, his voice low and filled with regret. "I didn't know who you were," he said, eyes darting. "But I've seen things. Stuff that didn't make it to reports. People disappeared. Evidence destroyed. He's not just a bad cop. He's protected. Like, untouchably protected." "Not anymore," she said simply. But the danger was escalating. That night, Aaliyah returned to her temporary apartment to find her door slightly ajar. Nothing was missing. Nothing broken. Just one of her drawers left open, a family photo turned upside down. It was subtle, but clear. A message. She sat on the edge of her bed, heart pounding, not out of fear, but anger. The quiet kind. The kind that steals your spine. She picked up her phone, dialed a secure line, and whispered into the receiver, "It's time to move." Meanwhile, Kessler's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. He snapped at reporters outside the courthouse. He cursed at his own legal team. At one point during trial, he banged the table so hard the judge had to call a recess. Yet despite it all, the system still bent around him. That's what frustrated the public, because the trial was slowly becoming a symbol of everything that was wrong. A seasoned officer with a decorated record, standing accused by a woman who, on paper, was just a witness. It didn't matter how many stories came out, how many inconsistencies were exposed, he was still wearing the badge. Still walking free. In the DA's office, tensions were rising. Files were being leaked to local journalists. Civil rights activists began showing up in court, sitting in the back rows in silence, their presence louder than any protest. Aaliyah knew she had to hold the tension. She couldn't break character. Not yet. But every day she walked into that courtroom, it was like loading a spring, winding it tighter, waiting for the right second to let it snap. She met with Marissa, the defense attorney, late one night in a small office behind the courthouse. Marissa's hands were shaking as she sorted through a stack of anonymous documents that had arrived at her door that morning. Internal affairs reports. Redacted statements. Surveillance photos. Some of them showed officers handing off packages. Others showed beatings. All of them connected to Kessler's precinct. "I don't know who sent this," Marissa whispered, "but it's deep. Like, this doesn't stop with him. These files, these are bigger than just Charlotte." Aaliyah leaned forward. "Then we take it further. We don't stop at the courtroom. We bring this into the light." Marissa hesitated. "If we do this wrong, you'll lose credibility. They'll bury this." "No," Aaliyah replied. "If we don't do this now, more people will be buried." The next morning, a surprise witness was brought in, an elderly woman named Claudette Jenkins. She was the grandmother of a teenager who had been arrested by Kessler 5 years earlier and died in custody. The case had been ruled suicide. But Claudette brought a letter, one she said was mailed to her by an officer who couldn't live with what he'd seen. In that letter, the officer confessed that the boy had been beaten. The letter was unsigned. But the handwriting matched another internal document that had mysteriously disappeared from evidence. The courtroom erupted. Kessler's attorney shouted objections. The judge slammed the gavel. But the damage was done. People were no longer just listening, they were believing. As the day ended, Aaliyah sat alone in a nearby diner, sipping black coffee as her mind replayed every moment. She knew what was coming next. The timing was perfect. The trap was set. But there was one last piece left to fall in place. And when it did, everything would change. She paid the bill, stepped outside into the cold night air, and looked up at the sky. Somewhere, a storm was building. Not outside, but inside the walls of that courthouse. Inside every lie that had ever been swallowed and buried. The tension was unbearable now. The city didn't even realize it was on the edge of something historic. And tomorrow, they would know. Tomorrow, the mask would fall. What happens when the prey turns out to be the predator in disguise? What will Kessler do, when he finds out who Aaliyah really is? Are you ready for the truth? Because it's coming. And nothing will ever be the same again. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. The kind of silence that isn't calm, but electric, like something waiting to break. That morning, the gallery was more packed than ever. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, civil rights activists lined the back row, and even city officials slipped in quietly, pretending they weren't there to witness what they suspected would become the most talked about moment in Charlotte's judicial history. The judge, usually aloof and bored, looked restless. The prosecution shuffled their papers with shaky hands. And Officer Bradley Kessler sat at the defense table, chin up, trying to hold on to the last fragments of control that were slipping through his fingers like sand. But his eyes darted constantly toward Aaliyah, now seated calmly on the witness stand once again, like nothing around her could shake her. She didn't blink. She didn't shift. She didn't need to. The moment had arrived. The prosecutor stood. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut clean through the air. "Miss Carter," he said, walking slowly toward the stand, "can you confirm for the court your professional affiliation?" Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, locking eyes with Kessler, who leaned forward, squinting as if trying to decode what was about to happen. She didn't look at the jury. She didn't look at the judge. She looked directly at the man who had humiliated her, who had silenced countless voices before hers, who thought this was still his courtroom. And then, in one simple breath, she dropped the truth. I am the special agent in charge of the Charlotte Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. There was no gasp. Just stillness. A single second of stunned silence that didn't feel real. The judge blinked as if unsure he'd heard correctly. The prosecutor didn't move. And Kessler's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His shoulders dropped, his face went pale, and the room, already on edge, exploded in murmurs, reporters scribbling furiously, hands covering mouths in shock. The judge called for order, banging his gavel repeatedly, but not even the pounding wood could drown the chaos that had just been unleashed. Kessler leaned toward his lawyer, whispering frantically. What the hell is she talking about? What is this? His voice cracked under pressure, sweat blooming at his collar, his confidence dissolving by the second. His attorney tried to steady him, but it was too late. Across the room, Aaliyah remained composed, waiting for the noise to settle. And when it did, the prosecutor continued, and during the course of this investigation, Miss Carter, were you acting under your authority as an agent of the FBI? Yes, Aaliyah said without hesitation. This courtroom was the final step in a long-term operation targeting systemic corruption and abuse of power within Charlotte's law enforcement community. Officer Kessler was the primary target. You could feel the entire foundation of that courtroom crack open in that moment. Kessler stood up, shouting across the room, "This is entrapment. She lied. She's not a real witness, this whole thing is illegal." Aaliyah didn't flinch. Her voice was calm, steady, deadly. "No, officer. What's illegal is coercing witnesses. Fabricating reports. Planting evidence. What's illegal is beating unarmed civilians. What's illegal is what you have been doing for over a decade. I didn't lie. I let you tell your truth. And you did. On the record. Under oath." The judge tried to regain control, but even he looked shaken. A new figure entered the courtroom, tall, dressed in black, wearing a badge around his neck. He handed a sealed document to the judge. The judge opened it, his eyebrows rising with every line he read. Then, slowly, he cleared his throat. This court has just received a federal warrant issued by the Department of Justice. Effective immediately, Officer Bradley Kessler is placed under arrest for obstruction of justice, witness tampering, falsifying evidence, and multiple counts of civil rights violations under federal law. Kessler froze. He didn't move. His lawyer stood up, stammering about procedure, about due process, but it didn't matter. The U.S. Marshals were already in the room. Two of them walked to the defense table. "Bradley Kessler," one said, "you are under arrest. Stand up and place your hands behind your back." He didn't stand. He looked around, as if still waiting for someone to save him. For a system that had always protected him to step in one last time. But nobody moved. No one reached for him. Not the judge, not his lawyer, not the fellow officers in the gallery who had once praised him. And that silence, the one he had used so many times to his advantage, was now suffocating him. As the cuffs locked around his wrists, he looked at Aaliyah, not with anger, but with fear. Pure, unfiltered fear. "You set me up," he said quietly, voice trembling, eyes wide. Aaliyah stood slowly, approaching him as the marshals prepared to lead him away. She stopped just close enough for him to hear, but not enough for anyone else to catch her words. Her voice was low, measured. "No. You set yourself up. I just gave you the stage." He was dragged out of the courtroom in stunned silence, reporters chasing after him, flashes exploding like fireworks. Aaliyah turned back to face the judge, who was still processing the reality unfolding in front of him. She handed him another sealed envelope. "This includes audio and video evidence gathered over the past 18 months, she said. "Conversations, documents, photographs. Not just of Officer Kessler, but several other individuals who have colluded in protecting and promoting illegal conduct in this courthouse and beyond. A full list of names has been provided to the Attorney General's office. Further arrests will be made by the end of today. The judge didn't respond. He simply nodded, silently accepting that this case was no longer under his control. Marissa, sitting at the defense table, stared at Aaliyah in awe. She stood, walking over as the room began to clear. You really were the head of the whole operation?" she asked, almost breathless. Aaliyah nodded. "Every step. From the moment I filed the complaint about my brother, it was already part of the plan. We knew Kessler would react exactly the way he did. All we had to do was let him believe he was untouchable long enough to expose everything." Marissa looked down, trying to absorb it. "You played the long game. You let them humiliate you." "I didn't let them," Aaliyah said, her voice edged with quiet fire. "I gave them the rope. They did the rest." Outside, the courthouse steps were swarmed with journalists. Protesters who had been gathering for weeks were now cheering. For once, the story wasn't just another disappointment, it was a breakthrough. Cameras turned to Aaliyah as she stepped out into the light, not hiding, not retreating, but walking forward. She paused for a moment, letting the noise wrap around her, letting the moment land. And somewhere, behind the cheers, someone shouted her name. Not Agent Carter. Just Aaliyah. A reminder that under the badge, under the mission, under the power, she was still the woman who came from the south side of Richmond. Still the girl who learned to fight not with fists, but with truth. And yet, even with Kessler in custody, the work wasn't finished. Because what Aaliyah knew, and what most people were only starting to realize, was that this case was never about one man. It was about a system. And this? This was just the first domino. The aftermath of Kessler's arrest rippled across the city like an earthquake. Within hours, news outlets across the country had picked up the story. Headlines splashed Aaliyah's face on every screen: FBI agent uncovers corruption in Charlotte Police Department, courtroom sting takes down decorated officer, justice, delivered from the inside. But behind the headlines and applause, the real storm was still brewing. Inside the FBI field office where the operation had been quietly coordinated for nearly 2 years, the tension had shifted from anticipation to action. Aaliyah sat in the war room, surrounded by whiteboards covered in names, lines, photos, connections, an entire network that extended far beyond Kessler. His arrest was the match, but now the fire had to spread. Across from her sat Director Jameson, flown in from D.C. that morning. His expression was unreadable, but his fingers were steepled in front of his mouth, watching her closely. "You understand," he said slowly, "what you've just triggered isn't going to end with applause. People in high places are going to panic. Some of them are going to try and bury this. Others will come after you." Aaliyah met his gaze, her voice unshaken. "Let them come. We're not finished. Not even close. There are names on that list who knew exactly what was happening. Judges, captains, city officials. They let Kessler operate like a king because he kept their problems buried." Jameson nodded, slowly. "And you're ready to take it all the way?" "I didn't come this far to stop at one man," she said, voice steady but filled with fire. "I came to dismantle the whole damn system." But outside the walls of her agency, in the streets of Charlotte, things were already shifting. A quiet panic had taken hold inside the police department. Officers whispered in hallways. Files vanished overnight. Some went on sudden leaves of absence. Others contacted lawyers. The chief of police, visibly shaken during a press conference, claimed he was unaware of the full extent of Kessler's crimes. But Aaliyah had already seen the emails. The signatures. The quiet approvals. They all knew. And now they were trying to rewrite the story. Meanwhile, Kessler sat in federal custody, locked in a holding cell that felt far colder than the one he once bragged about sending others to. His hands trembled, not just from fear, but from the realization that the empire he'd built, on silence, fear, and power, had crumbled overnight. His attorney, now less confident than ever, visited him with a grim face. "They have everything," she muttered, dropping a thick file onto the table. "Audio recordings, video surveillance, sworn statements, chain of command documentation. And the worst part? You never saw it coming." Kessler leaned back, voice hoarse. "This is a setup. She lied. She tricked me." His attorney raised an eyebrow. "You think that's a defense? She played by the book. You incriminated yourself a dozen times on the record." Kessler's hands curled into fists. "She made a fool out of me." "She didn't have to," the lawyer said sharply. "You did that yourself." Later that day, Aaliyah stood in a small, private conference room in the federal courthouse, preparing for a second wave of indictments. The DOJ had signed off on her extended operation. The arrest warrants were printed, folders sealed. She turned to her team, agents who had worked in silence for months, risking everything to uncover the truth. "Tonight," she said, pacing the room slowly, "we serve every warrant. No delay. No hesitation. We hit them at once. They've had enough time to hide. Now we expose them." Her second-in-command, Agent Rivera, stepped forward, face tight with determination. "And what about Judge Branton? The one who kept greenlighting Kessler's arrests?" "He's on the list," Aaliyah replied, her voice like stone. "He signs off on injustice like it's paperwork. We bring him in." That night, the city trembled. The FBI raided homes and offices across Charlotte. 3 senior officers were arrested, including a captain found with unregistered firearms and tens of thousands in cash. 2 assistant DAs were brought in for obstruction. And Judge Branton, in a scene that would become one of the most replayed moments in local news history, was escorted from his private residence in handcuffs, his robe still hanging by the front door. As he passed Aaliyah on the courthouse steps, he sneered, his pride barely holding. "You think this makes you a hero?" he spat. Aaliyah looked him dead in the eyes. "No. It makes me accountable. Something you've never been." He was led away in silence. Inside the FBI office, the mood was electric. Files once buried were now open. Victims who had long given up hope began calling, writing letters, asking if it was safe to speak now. Aaliyah made sure it was. She personally reopened the case files of nearly 24 civilians who had lodged complaints against Kessler and his team. For many of them, it was the first time anyone had listened. In one particularly emotional moment, a young woman named Tiana stood in Aaliyah's office, tears streaking her face as she held a worn photo of her brother, Jamal, who had died in a holding cell 2 years prior. "They told us he hung himself," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But he was scared of small spaces. He would have never." Aaliyah reached out, gently resting her hand over Tiana's. "I know. We're going to find out what really happened. And if someone's responsible, they won't walk away this time." But for every breakthrough, the pressure increased. Protesters gathered daily, not to shout, but to stand, peaceful, firm, present. Their silence became its own form of justice. News anchors debated whether Aaliyah's actions were heroic or dangerous. Politicians scrambled to take sides. Some praised her. Others accused her of grandstanding. But none of it mattered to her. Because she had only one goal, to clean house. One night, as she walked to her car alone, her phone buzzed. A blocked number. She hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was low, gravelly, shaking slightly. "You think this is over?" the man said. "You've made enemies. Big ones. People who won't forget what you've done." She didn't answer immediately. She stared at the night sky for a long moment before speaking. "Good," she said softly. "That means they finally see me." She hung up. The following morning, Aaliyah returned to court for a final statement. The room was quiet, not because of fear, but reverence. The judge presiding over this hearing was not one of the corrupt. He was appointed from another circuit to ensure fairness. He called her to the stand one last time. "In your words, Agent Carter," he asked, "why did you risk everything to do this?" Aaliyah took a breath, not because she needed time, but because she wanted her words to land. She looked at the crowd, at families of victims, at reporters, at her fellow agents. And then she looked into the lens of the camera streaming live across the nation. "Because silence has never protected us," she said. "Because too many people count on our exhaustion. They expect us to quit. They expect us to break. But we don't. We fight differently. Strategically. Relentlessly. Because justice isn't just a word. It's a responsibility. And I made a promise a long time ago that I'd never sit quietly while people like Kessler poisoned our cities. Today, we hold them accountable. And tomorrow, we keep going." Applause didn't erupt. But people stood. One by one. Silent, powerful, united. And deep in his cell, Kessler watched the broadcast, eyes wide, rage boiling beneath his skin. For the first time in his life, he wasn't feared. He was exposed. And Aaliyah Carter had done it without firing a single shot. In the weeks that followed the courtroom explosion, Charlotte transformed from a city sitting in quiet denial to one bursting at the seams with reckoning. There was no turning back. The fall of Officer Bradley Kessler had cracked open a sealed vault of secrets, and for every name arrested, 5 more came forward. The walls of institutions that had been fortified by decades of corruption began to crumble, not just under the pressure of public outcry, but because those inside them, judges, prosecutors, officers, had started turning on each other. Self-preservation kicked in. People who once covered for one another were now making desperate deals to save their own skin. And yet, amidst the chaos, there was still something disturbingly familiar about the way certain power players tried to pivot, to reframe the narrative as if they had been fighting for justice all along. Aaliyah watched them carefully, knowing too well that systems don't die quietly. They adapt. They lie. They survive unless you burn them from the root. Every morning started the same way for her now. Hours before sunrise, she sat alone in her office, reviewing stacks of reports, each one thicker than the last. Depositions, confessions, phone records, surveillance footage, every page was a window into a legacy of injustice. Her team worked around the clock, but the weight was beginning to show. Rivera hadn't slept properly in days. Agent Morales, after giving his own testimony, struggled with guilt, often pacing the halls late at night as if haunted by the silence he once maintained. Even Aaliyah, as disciplined as she was, felt the pressure and the subtle tremors in her fingertips when she poured her morning coffee. But this wasn't just work. It was war. A slow, grinding war of integrity against influence, of truth against tradition. And she knew that winning wasn't about one victory, it was about not backing down. Still, even with the momentum behind her, Aaliyah faced a new dilemma. One she hadn't fully anticipated. Not all the names on her list were monsters. Some were people who had made terrible choices under threat. Officers who had falsified reports because their families were at risk. Public defenders who had looked the other way because exposing the system would mean losing every case they'd ever worked on. These weren't villains. They were survivors. And as she stared at their files, one after another, she had to ask herself, where does justice stop, and vengeance begin? Her phone buzzed. A message from the Deputy Attorney General, "We need to discuss the Cooper file." She knew what that meant. Captain Anthony Cooper, former head of Internal Affairs, had just turned himself in. But he hadn't come empty-handed. He brought with him a hard drive, encrypted, time-stamped, containing a decade of emails, memos, internal documents. The drive implicated not only local officials, but state lawmakers. Suddenly, the case was no longer just about Charlotte. It was bigger. Far bigger. And Aaliyah had to decide whether to move forward publicly or escalate it quietly through federal channels. Going public would expose everything, but it would also make her a target far more dangerous than Kessler ever was. It could cost her career. Maybe more. She met with Director Jameson in a private conference room, where security buzzed in every corner. He laid the drive on the table between them like it was a live grenade. "If we open this," he said slowly, "there's no putting it back. These are people with power, Aaliyah. The kind that doesn't play fair." She didn't hesitate. "We open it." He leaned forward. "You sure? Because once we move, they will retaliate. Quietly. Strategically. They'll call in favors, bury stories, target people close to you." Her eyes didn't waver. "They already are." When the drive was decrypted, what they found inside rewrote everything. Names of officials who had publicly denounced Kessler but secretly funded his operations. Emails from campaign donors linked to private prison contracts. Text chains between city council members discussing quotas for arrest numbers in minority neighborhoods. It wasn't just corruption. It was engineered oppression. Profitable. Planned. Perpetuated over years with full awareness. The weight of this revelation hit Aaliyah harder than anything before. Because now she wasn't just fighting individuals, she was confronting an entire architecture built on suffering. And in that moment, sitting alone in her office at midnight, she faced a question that had no easy answer: what if justice means tearing down something that's been accepted as normal for generations? What if doing what's right means burning everything, even when the world isn't ready for the fire? Her team was divided. Rivera wanted to push forward, to indict everyone, no matter the consequences. Morales, now working in data analysis, cautioned restraint, fearing that if they went too wide, the legal structure wouldn't hold and the guilty would slip through on technicalities. Aaliyah listened to all of them, taking in every perspective, letting the weight of leadership sink deep into her bones. Because she wasn't just a symbol anymore. She was a decision-maker. And every choice had a price. Meanwhile, the media turned its lens on her. News vans parked outside her apartment. Commentators debated her ethics. Some called her a hero. Others painted her as a disruptor, accusing her of dismantling faith in law enforcement. And it stung, but not because she cared about their approval. It stung because they still didn't see the people she saw. The families that had been broken. The lives rewritten in police reports like footnotes. The mothers who showed up to her office with only photos and pleas for someone to finally listen. One day, as she left the courthouse, she was approached by a man, middle-aged, cautious eyes, worn suit. He introduced himself as Marcus Hale, a former officer who had once worked under Kessler, quietly transferred after filing a complaint that mysteriously vanished. He handed her a folder, his hands shaking. "They said if I ever talked again, my daughter would disappear. But now maybe there's a chance." Inside the folder were documents, phone recordings, surveillance captures, all supporting claims from victims whose cases had been dismissed. Aaliyah thanked him, and he hesitated before walking away. "I just want to know one thing," he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you really think any of this will change anything?" She paused, meeting his eyes. "It already has." But as the investigation grew, so did the pressure. Lawmakers began holding closed-door meetings. Anonymous threats flooded the agency. Internal reviews were launched against Aaliyah herself, thinly veiled attempts to discredit her leadership. She received notice that one of her old cases was being reopened for audit, an intimidation tactic, meant to distract and delegitimize. And still, she didn't stop. Because by now, it was no longer about what she was doing, it was about who was watching. Communities that had never seen justice were seeing it for the first time. And they were rising. Still, the question loomed: how much can one person carry? How do you balance justice with mercy? How do you hold power accountable without becoming consumed by it? And perhaps most haunting of all, what happens when exposing the truth is no longer the hardest part? What happens when you have to decide who gets to live with it? The lights in the FBI field office dimmed slightly as the sun sank behind the city skyline, casting long shadows across the glass windows and walls covered with notes, faces, and timelines. Everything had changed, and everyone in that building could feel it. What had once been a case was now a movement, one rooted in painful truths and public reckoning. Yet inside Aaliyah Carter's office, the air remained thick with a quiet kind of pressure, the kind that doesn't scream, but pulses through your chest, reminding you that something heavy still lingers, unfinished. The aftermath of the operation had created rifts not only in the institutions exposed but within her own team. Each member carried a different weight, and though they stood united, the lines between justice, morality, and exhaustion had begun to blur. Rivera sat across from Aaliyah, arms crossed, jaw tight. His voice was lower than usual, like the fight inside him was starting to bleed into something more fragile. "You saw the memo, didn't you?" he asked without waiting for her to answer. "They're pushing back. Not just legal reviews. They're trying to sanitize it. Make it smaller. Quiet. Neat." Aaliyah nodded once, slowly. "I saw it. They want a summary investigation. 3 high-level indictments, 1 public statement, and then closure." Rivera laughed under his breath, but it wasn't amused. "Closure? After everything? After everything we found? They want to fold this up like a bad headline and walk away clean." Aaliyah didn't respond right away. She stared at the bulletin board behind him where faces of victims hung next to names of perpetrators, some already arrested, others still under federal review. Each face, each case, each ruined life was a reason not to back down. But the weight of it all pressed against her ribcage like a tide rising too fast. "They're afraid of what comes next," she said eventually. "This doesn't end with Charlotte, and they know it. If this continues, we won't just be talking about one police department. We'll be unraveling decades of policy, money, politics, contracts, deals, careers. And they're scared." Rivera leaned in, voice more urgent. "So what do we do? Let them cut it down to something palatable? Let them parade around a few resignations and call it justice? Or do we keep going, even if it burns everything down?" That was the question Aaliyah had been asking herself in silence, every night she sat alone, reading reports until her eyes blurred. How far was too far? Where was the line between justice and self-destruction? She thought back to the families who had trusted her, the people who had whispered their stories into her ear like last prayers. They hadn't risked everything for a press conference and a promotion. They wanted real change. But real change required sacrifice. And not just from her. The next day, she was called into a closed federal meeting with the DOJ Oversight Committee. A tall man in a tailored navy suit, introduced as Director Lowell, led the discussion with calculated politeness. He praised her bravery, her strategy, her commitment to transparency, but every compliment was a prelude to control. "What you've done here," Lowell said, folding his hands neatly, "is significant. We've reviewed the files. We agree that the corruption uncovered is serious and demands action. That's why we're recommending a special prosecution team be appointed to carry out final proceedings. Quietly. Efficiently." Aaliyah's jaw clenched. "So I'm being removed." Lowell smiled without warmth. "You've done your part. Now we take it from here. Standard protocol. No need for you to stay involved in the prosecution phase." "Let me guess," she said, her tone sharp but steady. 3 indictments. No exposure to state-level actors. Media silence. Closure." His expression didn't change. "That's not how I'd frame it." She leaned forward, eyes locked on his. "Then let me frame it for you. You want to package this into a controlled narrative that minimizes fallout, limits liability, and keeps donors happy. You want to protect the illusion of accountability, not pursue the reality of it. And you think I'll step aside because I've done enough? Lowell held her gaze but said nothing. Around the table, the other members of the committee shifted uncomfortably. Aaliyah stood slowly, her voice low but forceful. I didn't do this for headlines. I did this for every name that never made it onto a docket. Every kid who got buried instead of defended. Every mother who stood outside a police station begging for the truth. And I'm not going anywhere. She walked out of that room knowing she'd made enemies. But the silence that followed her down the hallway told her she'd also made an impact. Back in her office, Morales sat waiting, his face pale, a folder trembling in his hands. They contacted my sister, he said, barely above a whisper. Said if I don't back off, her nursing license might be reviewed. How do they even know her name, Aaliyah? She closed the door behind her and sat across from him, her voice calm. Because we scared them. And scared people get desperate. But you did the right thing. You came forward. You helped this city start to heal. Morales shook his head, eyes glossy. I didn't do it to be brave. I did it because I couldn't live with the silence anymore. But now they're punishing her for my guilt. What kind of system does that? The one we're trying to break, she said gently. But we're not done yet. And you're not alone. Later that night, Aaliyah walked alone through Freedom Park, a quiet corner of the city where she often went to think. The weight of it all hung on her like armor. She remembered the words of her father when she was just a child and came home crying after being mocked for her skin. He'd pulled her close and whispered, "They'll try to silence you, baby, not because you're wrong, but because the truth terrifies them." The truth had never been louder. As she sat on a bench under a tree, her phone buzzed again, another anonymous message. This one wasn't a threat, but a plea. A former assistant to the mayor, offering a document in exchange for immunity. She stared at the screen, knowing what it meant. More names. More layers. More rot. And in that moment, she made her choice. She would not allow the system to shrink her story into a press release. She would keep going, not because it was easy, but because justice demanded weight. It demanded stubbornness. It demanded people who wouldn't trade integrity for convenience. But even then, even with the fire inside her, she felt something else creep in. Not doubt, but awareness. That this fight would never truly be over. That there would always be another name, another file, another life damaged by people who had forgotten what the law was supposed to mean. And the hardest truth of all. That sometimes, even when you win, it still doesn't feel like victory. The morning after Aaliyah received the anonymous message from the mayor's former aide, she sat in the dim light of her office, watching the city come alive through the tall glass windows. The streets below moved as if nothing had happened, as if the ground beneath them hadn't just been shaken, as if power structures weren't being torn apart one confession at a time. The quiet outside contrasted violently with what she felt inside. She hadn't slept. Not from fear, but from the weight of inevitability. Everything was moving too fast, and yet, not fast enough. The names in that message, if true, would not only destabilize the local government, they'd link elected officials to backdoor deals with private detention centers, policing quotas, and campaign funds soaked in exploitation. It was no longer about individual accountability. It was about revealing a machine, a deeply rooted apparatus that had been feeding itself on pain for decades. And she knew exactly what would happen once she opened that door. The next meeting with her team wasn't held in the usual conference room. Too many eyes had started watching. Too many leaks had begun to spring from places they once thought were safe. Instead, she asked Rivera, Morales, and Special Agent Bryson, an IT analyst recently brought in for digital counter-surveillance, to meet her at a closed, unmarked storage facility the Bureau used for seized evidence. No cameras. No press. No interruptions. As they huddled around a portable screen connected to a decrypted flash drive the whistleblower had dropped in a secure drop box the night before, the reality of what they were about to witness settled in. The footage began with a recorded phone call, dated 3 years prior, between a local councilman and a contractor from a private corrections corporation. The voices were cold, transactional. They spoke of target numbers, compliance metrics, and community pressure points. Phrases crafted to avoid legal scrutiny, but clear enough for anyone who knew what to listen for. Rivera shook his head slowly, his voice a low growl. This isn't corruption. This is strategy. This is policy. They built this system to profit from suffering and sold it as public safety. Morales, sitting on a crate, clenched his fists. And we enforced it. Even the good ones. Even me. We didn't ask. We followed orders. And people paid the price. Aaliyah didn't respond. She watched the screen with a stillness that felt like stone, but inside, her chest burned. She had known they would find more, but not this much. The flash drive contained names, meeting transcripts, financial records, and confidential communications that showed a systematic effort to criminalize poverty, to over-police communities of color, to push policies not because they worked, but because they filled cells and lined pockets. And the worst part? Most of it was legal. Crafted within loopholes. Protected by language. Supported by votes. They sat in silence for a long while after the last file ended. Finally, Aaliyah broke the silence. If we release this, they'll come after all of us. Not with guns, but with lawsuits. Audits. Discrediting campaigns. They'll pick apart everything we've ever done. Every choice, every mistake. Rivera met her gaze, his voice steady. Let them. We've already lit the match. Might as well watch the fire spread. Back at the office, she received a call from one of the senior bureau officials in D.C., Deputy Director Hill. His voice was formal, but the edge beneath it was impossible to miss. Agent Carter, he said carefully, we understand that you've been handed potentially damaging materials regarding local and state officials. I'm calling to advise extreme caution. This information, if mishandled, could destabilize critical infrastructure. The Bureau prefers resolution, not revolution. Aaliyah responded without hesitation. And what do you call a system that was never stable to begin with? The line went quiet for a moment. You've done incredible work. Historic. But sometimes protecting the whole means compromising the part. That's not leadership, she said. That's cowardice dressed as diplomacy. When the call ended, she stared at her own reflection in the dark screen of her monitor. She didn't recognize the woman looking back at her, not because she had changed, but because she had uncovered so much. Too much. And now, the choices before her weren't about right or wrong. They were about who would live with the consequences. The next day, she was called to a press hearing scheduled by the city council. They had framed it as an update on police reform, but Aaliyah knew better. It was damage control. An attempt to regain public trust before the next shoe dropped. As she sat at the long wooden table, surrounded by microphones and cameras, the mayor gave a statement about accountability, about healing, about unity. Words that rang hollow. Words that meant nothing without action. When it was her turn to speak, Aaliyah didn't hold back. This isn't about one officer. Or one department. This is about the culture we allowed to exist because we were afraid to question it. Because we were afraid of what we'd find if we pulled too hard. Well, we pulled. And now we see it. So don't ask me to help you bury it. Ask yourselves why you kept it alive for so long. The room erupted. Journalists shouted questions. Council members whispered urgently to one another. But one woman, an older black resident sitting in the back row, stood up slowly and began to clap. Others followed. Not many. But enough. Enough to let Aaliyah know that the city, though still divided, was beginning to awaken. That night, she returned to her apartment and found an envelope slipped under her door. No name. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. Her, as a child, standing in front of her father's old bus in Richmond. On the back, a handwritten message, "You are your father's daughter. Don't forget why you started." She sat on the edge of her bed, holding that photo like it was a lifeline. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to cry. Not out of weakness, but out of release. Because she realized something vital, this was no longer about winning. It was about remembering. Remembering the names. The stories. The people behind the files. And remembering that justice isn't clean. It's messy. It's painful. And it costs more than most are willing to pay. But she was willing. Still. And now, as the final pieces prepared to fall, she knew the next step wouldn't be taken alone. The city was watching. The people were rising. And the truth, raw, dangerous, undeniable, was already out of the box. The only question that remained was, who would still be standing when it settled? The final phase didn't arrive with fireworks or parades. It came quietly, with courtroom doors swinging open and verdicts dropping like stones into deep water. The justice system, so often used as a shield by the powerful, had been forced to turn inward on itself, and the weight of accountability crushed more than a few careers. The names on that flash drive were called one by one into federal court: council members who had signed away freedoms for political favors, judges who had traded impartiality for loyalty, corporate contractors whose wealth had come from bodies behind bars. Some tried to fight back, others wept, but none of them escaped what had been set in motion. Charlotte became a national symbol, not of scandal, but of reckoning, and with it, a model for what could happen when the truth refused to stay buried. Kessler remained incarcerated, his appeal denied after overwhelming evidence proved his guilt beyond negotiation. He was placed in a federal facility far from the city he once controlled with a badge and a smirk. His fall from grace was total, his pension stripped, his commendations erased, his name now spoken only in the context of disgrace. He became a footnote in the larger story, a reminder of how unchecked power decays. And perhaps most fittingly, his cellmate had once been someone he'd arrested under false charges. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Morales, after testifying in the final hearings, was cleared of all complicity and offered reinstatement under new leadership, but he turned it down. Instead, he joined a non-profit organization that worked with youth in underserved communities, teaching them about law, civil rights, and how to navigate a system that too often failed them. He found peace not in punishment, but in prevention, and slowly rebuilt the trust he thought he had lost for good. Rivera stayed by Aaliyah's side, promoted to lead a new internal justice unit within the Bureau, designed to investigate systemic abuses of power. The unit was small but deadly efficient, and its very existence was a signal that what happened in Charlotte would not be isolated. Together, they ensured that the fire they started didn't burn out, but spread where it was most needed. And Aaliyah Carter, her name became known far beyond the boundaries of Charlotte. She was invited to speak before Congress, asked to lead national task forces, offered positions that would elevate her to heights most people only dreamed of. But she declined most of them. She didn't want politics. She didn't want photo ops. She wanted purpose. And she found it when she was appointed to a new, independent agency tasked with investigating misconduct in all branches of law enforcement, created not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a mandate voted into federal law after public demand overwhelmed resistance. She accepted the position, not for glory, but because it allowed her to keep doing what she was born to do, protect the people who had never been truly protected before. Her final public statement before taking office was simple but unforgettable. Standing on the steps of a courthouse once saturated in silence, she said, "I'm not here to be celebrated. I'm here to make sure that what happened in this city never happens again. And if it does, I promise you, I'll be there. And I won't be quiet." Charlotte began to heal, not because wounds were gone, but because someone finally acknowledged they were real. Community programs were funded. Police reform passed through resistant hands. People started voting with a new urgency. Not everything changed. But something did. And that something was enough to give people hope. And now, if you've stayed with us through this story, ask yourself, what would you have done in Aaliyah's place? Could you have remained silent when speaking up meant risking everything? Could you have stood firm when the system you swore to serve turned on you for exposing its truth? This story wasn't just about a courtroom or a badge. It was about courage. The kind that doesn't roar, but whispers through action. The kind that keeps going when the lights fade and the crowd disappears. Aaliyah Carter didn't win because she was stronger than the system, she won because she never let it change her. So now, what about you? What will you stand for? What will you speak out against? How will you use your voice? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because your voice matters just as much. And if this story moved you, challenged you, made you reflect even for a moment, then make sure you subscribe to Tales of Twist. Here, we don't just tell stories, we reveal truths. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and never forget the power of one voice raised at the right time.